And joining me now for more on this is Manoj Kewalramani from Bangalore, India. He's a fellow in China Studies at the Takshashila Institution. Thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time. Is this the stepping stone that Washington and Beijing needed in order to reconcile their differences?
Thank you so much for having me. Look, the honest answer is that it's too early to say whether any of this is going to lead to any substantive dialogue. Over this year, what we have seen is that there has been an attempt to restart dialogue, particularly from the American side, and Beijing has resisted that ever since the spy balloon incident took place in February. We're now seeing a return to conversation from what was previously a state of no to some informal conversation. But it's still not substantive, and particularly from the point of view of reducing risks of military accidents in the South China Sea and other areas. I don't think we're anywhere close to a dialogue which is meaningful. Just last week, earlier this week, in fact, you had the dialogue in Singapore, the Shangri-La dialogue. The U.S. Defense Secretary and the Chinese Minister of National Defense were both present, but there was no meeting. And that's because of a structural issue. The U.S. side has placed the Chinese defense minister under CAATSA sanctions. Beijing wants those sanctions lifted. America says that the sanctions do not impede dialogue and risk reduction is important. Beijing says, no, you need to lift the sanctions because the dialogue needs to be amongst equals and you must recognize us as a peer power. So that's a structural challenge. And therefore, what we're seeing now is some initiation of conversation, but it's a long way to go before we can say that there is a new dialogue which can potentially avert the kinds of risks that you've just been talking about.
How seriously does Beijing take the U.S. when it comes to diffusing tensions in Taiwan Strait?
Look, I think Beijing has repeatedly said that it believes that the US policy is fundamentally duplicitous. It believes that the United States, while talking about not changing its Taiwan policy, is fundamentally eroding the status quo in terms of its support for Taiwan. At the same time, the United States believes that Beijing has step by step eroded the status quo by taking away Taiwan's diplomatic partners, reducing its space to cooperate in international organizations, and essentially exerting greater military force that we've seen over the last year across the Taiwan Strait. I don't think there's a serious belief in Beijing that the United States is interested in trying to roll back its changes in Taiwan policy. Therefore, what we're likely to see is much more tension in the Taiwan Strait, particularly with elections expected in Taiwan next year and the possibility that you will see another DPP administration. So I think that the next year, we're likely to see tensions remain high. And therefore, from the American perspective, it makes sense to have a dialogue on reducing risk. Beijing, however, is playing a game of high-stakes game of chicken, I would say, where it's saying that, well, we're not going to be engaged in that sort of a dialogue until you fundamentally back away and agree to what we believe should be your ideal Taiwan policy.
All right, Manoj Kewalramani, thank you very much for talking to us here on TRT World. Really appreciate your taking out the time.